Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Chai. I'm from the Graduate School of Political Science, Waseda University, and the title of my presentation today is An Introduction to the Conceptualization of Democracy. So for my presentation today, I will proceed as the following. First, I will provide the definition of democracy based on the previous researchers and scholars. And I will also talk about the development of the understanding of democracy in history. And also, I will elaborate on some of the alternative conceptualizations of democracy and some of the differences indices that try to capture the conceptualizations of democracies. After that, I will be talking about the different waves of democratization in history, and I will also talk about some special cases, the semi-democracies, quote unquote, and hybrid and mixed regimes. And to end the presentation, I will also talk about the essence of democracy as a wrap up. And also I will be discuss some of the scholarly discussions on the determinants of democracy, especially the well-known modernization series and survival series of democracy. So before we are able to provide a good definition of democracy, we should probably look at some other concepts as well to put democracy in context. So we should define what is a state, what is a government, what is a regime, and also look at the origin of the word democracy itself. So a state is an entity that uses coercion and the threat of force to rule in a given territory. And normally it's also for a specific population in order to maintain some level of social order and stability so that social and economic affairs can happen and be sustained. As you can see on the right-hand side, this is the book Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. So basically what Hobbes argued is that the formation of the state helps the people to escape a natural condition, a natural state, where there is brutal war against each other. So according to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, a state is more or less a social contract between the rulers of the country and those being ruled. And a government is a set of people who run the state or have the authority to act on behalf of the state. And in the case of democracies, a government is normally temporary, it's not permanent. And there is some shift in powers happening on a regular basis. And a regime is a set of rules, norms, or institutions that determine how the government is formed, how it is organized, and how major political decisions are made. So let's now talk about the origin of the word democracy. So it comes from the Greek word demokratia. So it means the rule by the demos. And the demos is the Greek word referring specifically to the common people, normally those with little or no economic independence and who are politically inexperienced or uneducated. So that is the common people. So probably we can say that democracy is a specific system of governance that tries to deliver or produce some processes, procedures, or channels that make the social contract between the rulers and the ruled quite desirable. And modern political democracy is defined as a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens, acting indirectly through the competition and cooperation of their elected representatives. So some of the important keywords can actually be highlighted from this long definition. So the democracy is related to rulers regarding how they come into power and how they are held accountable. And according to the Federalist Papers written by Hamilton and the two other authors, competition among factions and parties is a necessary evil. And also, democracy is about the citizenry, the base of political participation, and how civil rights are defined. In the previous times in history, only a small segment of the population had access to political decision making, based on whether it's age, gender, class, race, literacy, property ownership, or tax-paying status, and so on. But when history progressed, we had inclusion of more members of the population, and we had more inclusion of female voters, and we had this universal suffrage. Because of this inclusion, we have an expanding base for citizenry. And in terms of democracy, we have this expression of interests and values through competitive processes and channels, whether it's through associational, partisan, functional, territorial, collective, individual, or other types of channels. And we have this aggregation, consensus, and majority rule of individual preferences. So sometimes, because there is a majority rule, there is a possibility of the cultural and ethnic minorities' interests and rights being infringed or being left out from the public decision making and public discussion. And lastly, in democracy, we expect this pluralism and the availability of alternative forms of information. So no certain groups in the society are able to dominate the rhetoric of the whole society and the media. So there should be media freedom and there should be associational freedom as well. And now let's talk a little bit about the original understanding of democracy. So on the right-hand side, you can see Politics by Aristotle. So according to Aristotle, the regimes can be classified according to two dimensions. The first one is the number of rulers, one, few, or many. And the other dimension is whether it is a good form, which is for the good of all, or it is a bad form for the good of the rulers. In this case, we can classify all the regimes into monarchy, aristocracy, politia, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. As you can see, as classified by Aristotle, democracy was not seen as a good form of regime. So in the past, democracy was not always seen as a desirable way of arranging the governance. When we look at the word democracy, we should keep in mind that the understanding of democracy is not always stable in history. It's dynamic. And also, even though recently it's been receiving positive image, in history, it was not always the case. After talking slightly about the changes in the understanding of democracy in history, let's talk about the modern conceptualization of democracy. So democratization and regime changes has always been an important topic for comparative politics. And comparative politics is based on drawing insights from universal language and a specific dimension to compare regions in the world and to compare time series. So how we can conceptualize, measure, and operationalize democracy for empirical research has always been an important topic in this field, and is also subject to some debates by different researchers. So the first difference in conceptualizing democracy is whether we employ a substantive view of democracy or a minimalist or procedural view of democracy. So a substantive view of democracy classifies political regimes in regard to the outcomes that they produced, or looking at some specific policies, packages, or programs. So we look at the social and economic outcomes. On the other hand, the minimalist or procedural view of democracy classifies political regimes in regard to their institutions and procedures. For example, it looks at the electoral rules and also the elections. So the other difference in conceptualizing democracy is whether we employ a dichotomous or continuous view of democracy. And this can be very important when we look at some borderline cases. So how we can validly and reliably construct the conceptualization of democracy will have an important impact on how we come up with indices and how we measure democracy and how we run regressions and other empirical analyses between democracy and other indicators. So validly means that your index actually reflect the meaning of the concept you are measuring. And reliability means that when you repeat your measurement, it always gave you, or it always yield similar results. So we have to satisfy both validity and reliability when we come up with constructs. So which approach we should use in conceptualizing democracy really depends on our research hypotheses and questions, and also on the methodology we want to employ to test our hypotheses. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, in his book on democracy, Dow implies a two-dimensional conceptualization of a functioning democracy. And the two important elements for a democracy are contestation and inclusion. So contestation captures the extent to which citizens are free to organize themselves into competing blocks in order to press for the policies and outcomes they desire. In other words, they can organize themselves in blocks to articulate and aggregate their voices and to influence the public decision-making process. So the other element is inclusion, which has to do with who gets to participate in the democratic process and whether minorities are included. And importantly, polyarchy is a political regime that ideally has both high levels of contestation and inclusion, so it's an ideal type. So here I listed some of the measurements of democracy or the popular and well-known indices of democracy. The first one is democracy dictatorship DD measure. The second one is the polity 4 measure. And the last one is the Freedom House Index. So the DD measure focuses on the election of executive and legislature. And the polity 4 focuses on contestation and inclusion. And the Freedom House focuses on political rights as well as civil rights. As you can see from the components or questions that each index include for their country experts to measure democracy, the DD measure and the polity 4 measure probably focus more on the procedural or minimalist approach of democracy, whereas the Freedom House Index focus more on the outcomes and focus more on the substantive measures of democracy. As you can see from the right-hand side of the slide, there is a difference between the approaches the researchers take for the DD measure and the polity 4 measure. For the DD measure, we can see the dichotomous approach, whereas for the polity measure, we see a continuous approach. So here I show the maps for the three different measures that look at democracies in slightly different ways. And from the colors in the map, you can see that there are some differences in how countries are classified. On the right-hand side of the slide, we can see certain countries are semi-democracies or mixed or hybrid democracies. So those borderline cases actually appear to be classified in a slightly different way across the three measures of democracy. And those include some countries that are weak states, or some countries are young democracies in Latin America and Africa. So here I show the waves of democratization as mentioned by Samuel Huntington. So on the left graph, you can see the three waves of democratization. So the first one was the 19th century. The second one was after the World War II. And the third one is from the mid-1970s. And from the graph on the right, you can see a loose relationship between democracy and the income level of those countries. You can see that from the first wave of democratization, you don't see any clear co-movement or a clear relationship between income and democracy. However, for the second and third waves, you can start to see some kind of correlation between the two indicators. So now I will provide a short summary of the definition, conceptualization, and measurement of democracy. So first, it might not be a good idea to package all the desirable outcomes or traits of democracy into one big bag. Accountability, representation, responsiveness, legitimacy, and consent, they might sound beautiful, but those vague concepts might not be a good informative way for us to empirically examine democracy with other indicators in empirical research. And secondly, it might be a good idea to consider the definition of democracy to be based on this word uncertainty. So what is X and uncertainty is that no one is so confident on winning the upcoming election. There is always a chance of losing. And there is an ex post irreversibility. So you should ensure a relatively smooth shift in power or transition of power. And the incumbent government will now stay there and they will actually return and turn the power to the winning government. And there is repeatability, which means that the electoral rules will be repeated and used over and over again that set standards for future elections. In other words, the temporary winner has no superiority to bar the losers from taking office. And also, the momentary losers will respect the winner's right to make decisions on behalf of their country, and they will aspire to win in the future election. So if we do not have sufficient time to check all the relevant factors and elements encompassing the functioning democracy, we can have a quick check on whether a country is democracy or not, based on the three important observations. So they include the existence of elected executive, elected legislature, and more than one party. So when these factors are in place, we could probably be quite confident in the incumbent parties having a chance of losing in the future, and where outside parties can have a chance of winning in the future. And there are no arbitrary power shifts, and there is the relatively smooth power transfers, and also there is the written and exercised electoral rules that set the standard for elections. And also, there is no centralization of unlimited political power and resources, and also the political parties, they should always consult other stakeholders and interest groups in order to win elections. So according to Bayes' rule, or the conditional probability, the probability of a country being democratic, given that seats will be more than 2/3, is quite low. So that we can see whether the seats are dominated or not, and have a guess of whether the country is democratic. So probably we can use this as a rule of thumb. After looking at all the concepts that we listed here for categorizing democracy, we can see that in a democracy, no certain group or a certain person has access of all the resources and all the political powers. And the certain groups and the leaders should always consult other members of society. And for the citizens, they have alternative choices to choose. And also they have access to alternative sources of information. So no information and no government dominate the whole society. After categorizing democracy, let's spend some time to talk about the determinants of democracy. In other words, what actually contribute to the emergence and survival of democracies. So there is a classic modernization theory, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. So there is the traditional society on the left and the modern society on the right. So the traditional society include large agriculture, small industry, small service, and dictatorship. And the modern society includes small agriculture, large industry and service sectors, and democracy. So a basic and simple modernization theory states that when industrialization and economic development are achieved, we can expect the emergence of democracies. However, some other research actually show that this relationship might not be so clear. And actually, the modernization theory seems to be too simplistic. And actually, there may be some other factors, especially confounding factors, that come into the relationship between economy and democracy. And culture can be one of those confounding factors. And some scholars have also argued how civic culture can be a basis for the emergence of democracy. and how the democracy can actually impact on the culture in the opposite direction as well. In other words, the causal directions might not be clear, and we should include a range of socioeconomic factors when testing modernization theories. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, culture, economic development, and democracy can be located or positioned in the different places in the causal chain. So now let's take a more detailed look into the explanations for democracy and the modernization theories. So there are actually different types of modernization theories. The first one looks at the emergence of democracies. In other words, the transition from dictatorships to democracies. And the second one looks at the survival of democracies, which means how current or existing democracies are consolidated and sustained. And another factor or hypothesis we can probably take into account is the oil curse or the resource curse. How countries, for example, the ones in the Middle East, who have abundant natural resources and rely on the export revenue of those resources, hinder their democratic development. And also, we can ask ourselves whether the civic culture and the social capital is a prerequisite for a functioning and good quality of democracy, or they come as outcomes of democracies. When we test the relationship between economy and democracy, there are so many other socioeconomic factors which can be endogenous or exogenous that should be taken into account as control variables or dummy variables when we run regressions and find correlation coefficients. Those control variables might include ethno-linguistic fragmentation, colonial legacy, political history and past regime stability, and the international democratic climate and the world order. And also, we might expect that when we employ different data sets and methodologies, we can yield different results. And also, we need robustness and causality checks to see whether our correlations and causations are actually reliable. Even though there are counter-arguments and contradictory debates on this topic in the field of comparative politics, we can actually make some general conclusions. So first, no fixed threshold of income level that we could predict the emergence of democracy. It is highly context-based. And there is no specific culture or religion that simply provides the best soil for democracy to emerge. And also, the statistical significance of variables differ for democratic emergence and survival. And they are different if we consider different socio-democratic indicators. And also, there is no homogeneous income effects, but actually, sometimes we can observe nonlinear effects. Or in other words, there are some kind of diminishing marginal returns of increasing income. And also, democracies are not necessarily more efficient economically than other forms of government, at least in the short term. So probably economic benefits or fruits of democratization do not come very fast after the emergence of democratization. And it is a good idea for us to see modernization as a rather broad and complex process, rather than a single line of causation. This process will involve various social changes happening at the same time, including economic, social, and political, and other types of changes. Given the results of some of the research in the current literature regarding how democracies have a chance to emerge in various different socioeconomic contexts, the books by Samuel Huntington and Max Weber, titled The Clash of Civilizations and the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, they might not be so applicable empirically in today's literature.